Based on the comments I saw on my unboxing stream, it seems like people wanted the GMMK Pro to be an utter failure, but it really isn't. It's true that when a large outsider company tries to make something for a niche hobby, they usually fail, but it seems like they did the research. That doesn't mean there aren't shortcomings though. In this review, we'll be covering the glorious GMMK Pro and what it could mean for custom keyboards at large. As always, I purchased this with my own money through the reservation sale. To the best of my knowledge, Glorious has no way to connect my order to the channel. I want to drive this point home because some people were calling me a shill for saying some positive things, but if people are going to have such a blatant misunderstanding of how this works, then what's even the point to turning down all of those free products and sponsorships? The GMMK Pro takes on a pretty safe design. It's got some medium-thick bezels to make room for the foam strips with moderately rounded corners. One weird thing I noticed was that the cutouts on the top are more rounded than I'm used to. Under close inspection, this makes keycaps with sharp corners like Cherry Profile look a little cramped. It seems to match the corners of OEM profile keycaps pretty closely. Kinda weird since the line of keycaps Glorious is launching is going to be Cherry. The layout is an exploded 75% with a separated function row and a rotary encoder. Exploded here just refers to the separated arrow and navigation keys. I generally don't like 75% layouts because their width is too close to their depth, making them look a little unwieldy, and it's no different here. I do like the separated function row since it alleviates some of the overcrowded look on fully compact 75% layouts, but I absolutely hate the exploded arrow keys. I don't know why there's been such a trend to do this, but I've always thought this looked horrendous. This really only works when there's an entire numpad to balance the alphas, not just an anemic single column of a nav cluster. Nevertheless, a lot of people do like it, so you do you. For me, the best 75% layout is the Xeno, which essentially just adds a separated function row to a regular 75%. The side reveals that this is a seamless design where the top case covers the bottom case, eliminating any externally visible mating lines. I prefer this approach because I think it makes the design look more intentional. There's a fair amount of overhang here, so you can pretty easily use these as handles. This is good because a 75% is a little too deep for me to pick up with one hand. Also on the sides, you can see the side LED diffuser. I think this actually cheapens the look quite a bit. Just something about the thinness and the roundness of the cutout reminds me of plastic pre-builts. I would much rather go without these altogether. Here, you can see that the bezels are just barely high profile, meaning they come up right underneath the bottom of the keycaps. From certain angles, you can see the switches. This is similar to the old Rama M65A, but designs have generally moved to be a little taller than that over the years. Definitely something I'd like to see addressed in revisions. The rear has the ever-popular inward cut seen in boards like the Polaris or the KBD-8X Mark II, though not as deep. The USB Type-C port is centered within this cut, so it can be a tiny bit difficult to plug it in without looking. The port location is recessed, but the port itself is flush with the case. Type-C ports need to be pushed inward a little to hide the entirety of the cable shielding. Not so big of an issue, but I'd definitely like to see this get fixed. The bottom is pretty simple with the absolutely massive and deep Glorious engraving and 4 rubber feet. There are really only a couple missteps in the design, with the most major being the top bezel height. The side LED cutout and the ugly layout means I'm not a fan of how this looks, but it's mostly inoffensive, so no real harm done there. Before disassembly, you'll want to remove the knob because the top won't come out otherwise. Afterwards, you can get into the case by the 8 Phillips head screws on the bottom. You'll want to watch out for the daughterboard cable with the PCB. I usually just undo it from the mainboard side. Taking a look at this bottom piece first, you can see the 10 foam strips as well as these 2 side mounting points. Some of these look a little roughed up, but thankfully, replacement foam is included in the box. We can also see the somewhat large daughterboard with a cable in its own routing channel. Very nice. The right rear corner has these 2 posts that are used to align the keyboard assembly relative to the case. The top is a pretty intricate little piece. You'll see the corresponding top foam strips as well as these 8 additional alignment pieces. These are used to push the plate towards the center so that it won't shift much during use or assembly. More in the theme of alignment are these 2 pegs that go in the slots in the plate next to the rotary encoder. Further, the 2 corner screw holes have protrusions that fit into keys on the bottom case. It seems like alignment was a big focus here, which is interesting since seamless cases tend to not have this issue much. Nevertheless, refreshing to see while certain enthusiast customs have pieces that slide all over the place. The top also has these side diffusers that are attached really securely with tabs, screws, and slots. You don't really need to ever remove these, and I bent mine while disassembling, so I'd just leave it alone. One last thing here is that the side walls of the top piece are very thin, and combined with the cut for the diffuser is actually flimsy. One of mine will clack when I touch it to pick it up. The case diffuser is reinforced by the PCB diffuser, which is sandwiched between the PCB and the plate. This seems to get rid of all hotspots that you'd find on something like the drop control. Moving on to the aluminum plate, this guy seems to be stamped and bent. You couldn't get these indents and such on the CNC plates that we see on customs. The finish is impeccable and the cuts are not much sharper than usual. This plate has foam glued onto it at a single point. It is pretty shoddy compared to the stuff you can find on some modern boards. These have plate mount stab cutouts, which was a point of concern for me since these cutouts need to be pretty tight to work well, but if you make them too tight, PCB mount stabs might not work. Well, the thing ships with Glorious's own PCB mount stabs, so that part's addressed, and when I tried fitting cherry plate mount ones, those worked fine as well. Plate mount stabs are generally less desirable than PCB mount ones, so I'm not really sure why they included it. The NK65 supposedly uses plate mount stabs to cut down on assembly costs, but screw-ins on the GMMK Pro are probably the most time-consuming of the stab varieties. I don't think anybody would miss it if this was made into PCB mount only. Speaking of the stabilizers, Glorious's goat stabs come looped from the factory and are mostly alright on the smaller ones, with quite a bit of tick on the spacebar. Here's a little test to see if they improve well. Looks pretty good so far, but the polycarbonate plate is where I started having problems. I didn't notice it during the unboxing stream, but it seems like for one reason or another there is a significant sizing issue. As I started to screw the PCB into the plate, I noticed that the stabs were feeling super tight. When I finished, I saw that there was a significant bow to the assembly. This persisted even after the switches were installed. The plate seems to be injection molded, so my guess is on some kind of shrinkage like you see on PBT keycaps. So it is actually possible to install this build into the case and have a functioning keyboard, but you'll have some significant spacing issues. You can see on the escape key that there's misalignment, and on some extreme off-center presses, it'll actually collide with the bezels. I reached out to support about this and went through their RMA process, which involved sharing an uncut video with my order number and a demonstration of the issue. They sent me a replacement, so it seems like Glorious will follow through on their 2-year warranty. Speaking of which, warranties are unheard of in custom keyboards. For example, if during a dry winter day I shock my Space 65 and blow out the side LEDs, I'm out of luck even though that's just a deficiency in design. The terms are unclear, but this is sure to inspire a bit of confidence in your purchase. Anyway, the replacement is exactly the same as the first and has the same issue, so that's going to need some reworking on their side. I think injection molded plates are the way to go when you're planning on making a lot of them, but they'll need to resolve some of these issues before it's viable. The PCB uses Glorious's own hot swap sockets that look pretty much the same as Gateron or Kale ones. The holes for 5-pin switches on this seems a little looser than normal, which means switches might come out with keycaps when using a softer plate material like polycarbonate. The encoder seems to be hand soldered with a little bit of flux residue remaining. The encoder itself is mildly tactile, meaning you're going to feel the notches. Not really sure what the official terminology is. It also has a ton of mounting points that screw into the plate around the perimeter, as well as 2 in the center. These are probably here to let you change switches without taking the board apart. One interesting thing about the center mounts is that the standoffs are free to move back and forth, so they might not be creating hotspots like with rigid standoffs in the Vega or the D65. The last interesting thing about the PCB is that it has side tabs that rest on the lower foam strips on the bottom case. Maybe this provides a bit of bracing so that you can hot swap? Not really sure what this is about, but it doesn't seem to introduce any noticeable stiffness. Lastly, we're starting to exit static shock season, but when I shocked the GMMK Pro, there wasn't any strange behavior to the connection, so I think the case must be grounded, probably through the daughter board. Overall, the GMMK Pro's internals are well thought out. It seems to be about on par with current customs with some good features like daughter boards with routed cables and alignment pins. And the thing about metal keyboards is that if you're coming from a pre-built, including the enthusiast ones like the NK65, they're going to feel much more premium without a doubt. At a built weight of over 1.5 kilos, this is sure to spark the same kind of joy I had with my first metal keyboard. For customs, the finish quality is often the distinguishing factor between a $200 and a $500 board. So you might have expected some issues here, but the GMMK Pro's finish is actually really good. The texture is pretty fine, about matching what I have on the TF-V2 as well as the Space 65, and I don't really see any discolorations in the exterior or the interior. The only thing I found was some light machining lines in the interior of the bottom, but we see that on things like the $400 K, so that seems easy to excuse. One point to note is that this silver color is named White Ice. As you can see, it is neither white nor ice, so keep that in mind. I was expecting a really rough surface, streaks, scratches, and the like that we've seen on older KBD fans boards, but this is honestly pretty great. One of the marketing points was full programmability through the Glorious Core software, as well as compatibility with QMK and VIA. Some of these were not met at the time of writing. The first-party software will probably meet the programming requirements for most people, but is much more inconvenient to use and lacks some core features we've come to expect from something like QMK. But before we even get into those, I need to mention that the box comes with a big warning to update the firmware before use. For the record, it does work fine without the update. When I tried updating on my laptop, it would repeatedly fail, but then it worked fine on my desktop. To reprogram a key, you press on one, as you would in VIA, then scroll through the giant list until you find the function you want. Then you can't forget to press save or it'll do nothing. Once you save, a little orange bar will show up on the key location to mark it as reprogrammed, rather than actually changing the legend in the graphic. I don't know about you, but the primary way I access layers is through MO or momentary activation. This is when a layer becomes active only as long as you're holding down the key. This is a very basic piece of functionality that's missing from the Glorious Core software. As a matter of fact, the only way you can change layers is via a cycle key, which is inconvenient if you wanted to assign arrow keys in your home row accessed by caps lock. One of the biggest draws to the GMMK Pro, the rotary encoder, is by default set to volume control on turns and mute on presses. That's probably good enough for most people, but what if you wanted to change it? That's right, you can't even do it on the first-party software. One maybe minor last thing is that Glorious Core doesn't fit on a 1080p screen when Windows is scaled up to 125%. I know it's weird, but that's what I find comfortable on a 13-inch laptop screen at my viewing distance. At the time of writing, QMK support is in the main branch of the repository, but with a couple problems. First, the positions for the keys directly to the right of the spacebar are swapped. Not such a big deal, but goes to show the amount of attention they put into this. Second, and maybe more severe, is that there is no RGB support. You could argue that anyone who's going through the hassle of flashing QMK on the GMMK Pro is not super interested in RGB, but that's half the PCB's functionality entirely missing from the firmware they advertise compatibility with. It's not hard to interpret this as the absolute minimum they could have done to tick that checkbox in their marketing. But that checkbox actually says QMK and VIA, not just QMK. At the time of writing, there is no official VIA support for the GMMK Pro. There are 2 pull requests open from the community that adds it, but nothing from accounts associated with Glorious. They had all of the manufacturing time to get this support going, but they didn't. The first batch was already shipped, and while the box saying VIA compatible is probably not a lie from a technical standpoint, it does reflect poorly. To make matters worse, Glorious says that due to the global chip shortage, certain future PCBs might use a different MCU, and that version won't immediately have QMK support. I know a 75% layout is big enough that programming it is largely going to be a set once and forget kind of thing for most people, if that. But with proper programmability being such a core enthusiast feature that we now take it as a given, Glorious's half-assed support is unacceptable. When I ordered the GMMK Pro, I was fully expecting them to make a couple glaring mistakes that'll compromise the typing experience, but I didn't find much like that. The closest would be the inclusion of the case foam, which compresses against the PCB enough to eliminate all flex. If you choose to use this foam, you'll be giving up any difference offered by the mounting mechanism or the plate material. As mentioned before, the plate is attached to the PCB at 2 points in the center and several more around the perimeter. The typing feel with and without the screws seem largely unchanged, so I'll just leave them on. To find out if the foam strip mounting mechanism is noticeably different than the usual, I have the KBD-8X Mark II, which is top mount, built with aluminum and polycarbonate plates with aftermarket PCBs that lack the flex cuts. I chose these because the mounting points between a TKL and a 75% are about the same distance away, so the feel should be pretty similar. Do note that even still there will be uncontrollable differences, so the comparisons might not hold universally. Comparing aluminum to aluminum, the difference is small but noticeable. The GMMK Pro has a slightly less harsh bottom out that makes it feel a little bit like a more plasticky plate, such as carbon fiber. Because of the aforementioned warp issue, you should take the polycarbonate plate comparison with a bit of salt. As is, the bottom out is slightly softer and carries a little more vibration from the typing hand to the other. Just guessing here, but if we can get a fixed polycarbonate plate, it should introduce less internal stress when squished down between the foams, providing an even bouncier feel. So it seems like the so-called gasket mount does offer an experience different from harder mounts. This is consistent with my findings on the Vega when compared to harder mount 65%, so I think the GMMK Pro's mounting solution is working as intended. Same as the feel, I didn't really find any glaring problems with the sound. But maybe that doesn't really mean much because I'm not so meticulous about it like some other members in the community. Compared to my top mount 8X, the GMMK Pro seems to be a little more muted on the bottom out for both plate materials. As for the foam, you should have a listen for yourself. Please keep in mind that no sound test is representative of real life and that this will not be comparable to any other sound tests out there. My impressions are that the plate foam doesn't really do much, while the case foam changes the sound significantly. A lot of you will prefer the sound with foam, but I strongly recommend against it as it'll remove any effect of the special mounting mechanism. Maybe you scoffed at the GMMK Pro's initial announcement. I know I did when I saw their renders showing switches going the wrong way relative to the PCB, but they actually did a pretty good job here. The board really only tries to do one thing: tick checkboxes. It's seamless, has QMK, has RGB, is CNC aluminum, is gasket mount, is hot swap, has a daughter board, has a knob, supports 5-pin switches, has proper switch orientation, has screw and stabs, and more, and you'd probably expect the output to be a mess, but it's mostly a success. There are definitely shortcomings and mistakes like the lack of proper QMK and VIA support, near unusable polycarbonate plate, and pre-installed foam that destroys the typing experience, but it's actually a lot better than I expected and a lot better than certain customs that cost much more. Before some of these issues are even addressed, this should already put a lot of pressure on the cheaper segment of the market, because there's no way in hell I'm going to recommend something like the Bella or the D65 over the GMMK Pro, at least from a typing experience and build quality point of view. And I'm guessing things like the Rama Kara, which costs $160 before shipping and without the internal dampener, is going to be pretty much dead on arrival. Also consider drops line of boards that this seems to most directly compete with. Those were already bad and overpriced, and the GMMK Pro just puts the final nail in the coffin. Again, if you hate the way the GMMK Pro looks, then that's fine, but if you're just looking for a metal keyboard with a good typing experience, then there's really nothing else at this price point. So, do I think the customs market is going to calm down any from the ever-increasing prices because of this? Not really. I think a good number of potential buyers will reject it as just another gaming company's keyboard and associate it too much with the cringe gamer marketing that Glorious is so fond of. If you can get over the giant Glorious, this really is a good keyboard, especially for the money. Even though it comes from an entity that couldn't care less about the community, it's more of a proper custom keyboard than something like the NK65. For now, with the exception of the Kara, the enthusiast plastic pre-builds are still significantly cheaper, but I'd argue the perceived quality difference between injection molded plastic and milled aluminum is absolutely worth the about $70 to $80 price difference. I think the most relevant competition to the GMMK Pro is going to be KBD fans who's been raising their prices significantly over the years while still making strange mistakes. It'll be cool to see what happens to the very interesting entry to mid-range segment of the market.